Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dan Snyder, and I'm happy to be working with you today. And today, my presentation is talking about safety culture, and more specifically, how do we really measure safety culture? And if you're using a survey, is it lying to you? In other words, how much can we trust some of that survey data, and what might we do with it to really understand more deeply about culture and what those things mean? So just to kick off, we've got about 45 minutes together, and hopefully you'll be able to chime in your questions on the chat in real time as you have them, and then I'll be moderating the chat as well. So if there's questions in the chat, I'll try to answer them as quickly as I can. But this is a pre-recorded session, so as I'm talking live, I'll moderate the chat as well. So again, welcome to the session, and really, what is cultural maturity? What is safety culture maturity? And I'll just start with talking a little bit about culture. And really, safety culture is something we use as a descriptor, but in reality, there's really only one culture, and it's the organizational culture. But within that organization, the safety element or the safety factors about that culture can be measured very specifically. Another thing that I'd say that was a quote from a colleague in a company that's doing quite a bit of safety culture work internally and doing really solid science and research. It made the comment that your organization has as many cultures as it has leaders. And I found that to be a real interesting concept. And I think that's true in that every work team, every work crew, every leader, all the way through the organization has certain cultural elements to it, or maybe even subcultures in it. So it's a very complex thing. And culture in an organization or organizational culture has a lot of elements. And safety is one that we can measure. And with safety, it also might have some inferences or indications of other problems within the organization or other successes, things that you're doing very well in the organization. So safety is a good way to reference that and take a look at it. So when we talk about safety culture, it's part of the organizational culture, and it's really looking specifically at the safety and health factors or elements in that culture, and really get an understanding of the climate in the moment versus maybe the entire culture as an organization. And those type of things are really dependent upon the context, the people, the leadership, the circumstances. There's much that gets involved with that. And when we talk about the idea of maturity, what we're really looking at is how robust is that safety element within a culture? Is it something that is very emerging or new, or is it something that's very well established in a good way, a positive culture or a negative culture? You could maybe look at it in those terms. And so to try to develop the science, the safety science to measure culture in a real empirical way that we can make meaning of the data is, I think, where we're at professionally to really ensure that what we're evaluating with culture has some validity, has some reliability, has some science, and some confidence in what those numbers are telling us, or what that information is telling us. And so when you think of overall safety culture to bring you into a philosophical perspective, going back to the ancient Greeks and Aristotle and logic and some of these things around the condition of humanity, this idea of culture, really there's three major problems, I guess we'll say, in philosophy. And one is the knowledge problem, and that's epistemology. And that's honestly part of my scholarly pursuits. And really the question of the knowledge problem is, how do you know what you know to be true? And how do people interpret safety information in a way? And how do they know that this is the best way to protect themselves, for example? Do they even know the hazard exists? Do they recognize that? And if so, what informs them, and what knowledge are they driving from? It could be experiential. It could be what the company's providing as acceptable levels of risk or acceptable procedures for safety, the value of safety that's communicated, and the knowledge that safety is a value in this organization. Those ideas around knowledge, and those have to be grounded in some sort of evidence by that individual or perception by that individual. So a lot of what we measure is what is the perception or the knowledge or the information people have about culture or about how they view the culture, the safety within the culture they're in. Then there's the conduct problem. This is ethics, and ethics really is something beyond legal requirements. And so, when you're looking at ethics, what's fair, what's just, those that might be, studying the human operational, performance, organizational performance systems or HOPS, that idea of a fair organization or a fair culture, a just culture. That's part of the cultural element in how we act or behave. And ethics is really the study of morals and actions, what a company actually does to protect their workers. And then there's the power problem or the politics or the authority. This might get into, obviously regulations and things, but more about who has the authority or the power to make certain decisions. And so that decision-making process of the worker versus a supervisor, a foreman, or a manager, or an executive leader, these decisions that are made at these levels have an impact on the overall safety. And why are they making these decisions? And part of the power problem is the competing interests of production versus safety. That might example of an ethical dilemma that we might find, and it stems from power and what we need to do to conduct business, and then what knowledge is needed to be able to conduct that business safely. So these are just more of a way to wrap a larger idea or thinking around culture and what all might be involved with culture. To really kind of take us back a little bit, I want to take some history and try to show where we're leading up to the current state of safety culture research. And really, this was one that was in the United States, and this was in 1995, the Bradley curve. This came from DuPont, and this really did start the DuPont stop program. So for those that might be familiar with this observation program of a DuPont stop, it was really formed around this idea, the Bradley model or Bradley curve, to where the idea is that if we increase, teams, the idea of interdependent people working together to solve safety problems or ensure that what we're doing is as safe as it possibly can be. That interdependent teams, the idea is that if we have that, it will lower the injury rate. So they were very interested in tying culture, if you will, or activities in culture or individual perceptions to the idea of injury rates and reduction of injury rates, which is ideally what we all want. And the idea is that the more reactive or natural instincts to where basically there is no formal system. Everybody's on their own, every worker for themselves. It's up to you to be safe. And if you're not, too bad. This idea increases the injury rate where there's no system, no formal safety processes. Safety's not integrated into operations as a part of doing business. And workers are kind of left on their own. Then dependent gets into supervision. This might be rule enforcement. If we enforce rules and regulatory requirements and things like that, that becomes dependent. Safety in the culture is dependent upon that supervision or that direction. Then you get people that with the certain level of knowledge are more independent to where I can take care of safety myself. I can make decisions. I know what's expected of me. I have time to do safety. And then you get into a more of an interdependent teams approach to where safety issues are really kind of part of the entire process and the thought process among all levels. This was, I think, the idea of the Bradley curve, but it was really trying to tie culture or ideas of culture to injury rates. And I think that there was something to be said for that. A little more advanced model came from the UK, and really the HSE out of the UK does some great research. And for those that aren't familiar with you might look them up. They have quite a bit. And this safety cultural maturity model was really sparked in 2000 by the Kiel Center for the Health and Safety Executive of the UK. And this is the model that really kind of started the modern models. And the interesting part here is it's a 5-level or 5-phase model. The idea is that emerging level 1 is kind of that natural instincts. We really don't have anything in place to a model that's a level 5, which is a continually improving, or this idea of sustainability. And if you look at kind of the improving safety culture on the far left top arrow, and the idea is they're correlating that to consistency. So the more we're consistent in our safety processes and messages and the way we do safety and health in an organization, the more consistent we are, the more we're going to improve safety culture. It didn't tie to injuries. It really wasn't tied to lagging numbers. This was really more of a leading model, I think, to where we're looking at safety culture as a leading indicator for certain problems or things down the road, or potential hazards and risks. So this idea of improving safety culture was really marked by this. So if you look at the other levels, where you have these 3 levels or leading performance indicator, I think that it went from 1 to a compliance or rule-driven organization into this idea of how do we improve safety beyond just the regulations, perhaps. And then as an educator and an epistemologist, interested in knowledge, this idea of a learning organization, a level 3 learning organization, I think that was a very pivotal part in this model, in the philosophy of this theory, in that if we have lessons learned that are implemented into actual practice, for example, to me, that's an example of an organization at a very high level of cultural maturity. They learn from lessons, whether there was a near miss or an actual incident or a mishap. Those lessons learned are then incorporated into improvements on the job directly to prevent that injury from happening. So I think this idea of a learning organization is prevalent throughout other models I've seen. But that's what organizations that consistently stay in that level tend to have a cooperating or a continually improving type safety culture on the maturity model. I believe this might have been from a guy by the name of Hudson, perhaps, or this is the Hudson model. The previous one was a Keel's model from Fleming. I believe Fleming was the researcher on the other model. This was a year later, so again, they're contemporaries, and this one really picked up on the learning organization and made the model say that if we increase information, or that we ensure that people have knowledge, they're informed, the more the organization is informed, the learning organization, that's dependent upon increasing trust and accountability. So here this model's evolved from going from a learning organization, levels of learning organization, into that idea of trust and accountability to really drive that change or to drive that learning organization and really reframe the 5 levels into more phases, which is still a hierarchical model, which I'm gonna basically go against, or not really go against, but suggest that it's not linear. I don't think these models are really linear like they show. You can measure organization by these levels, but you're going to have pieces of any of this in any organization at any given time. It's just how much of each phase do you have present in your organization. So the more generative or proactive ideas or processes or procedures or philosophies you have, you're going to have more trust and accountability. You're going to have a more informed workforce. Versus maybe companies that are in certain areas, or even within the same company, that is a real high performing, high reliable safety company, but there might be parts that are pathological. In other words, they really don't have as much of a robust safety in this particular part. You'll also see this for big companies that with mergers and acquisitions, to where you have a company that might be doing very well. They're a calculative or proactive type version, but they acquire a pathological or reactive culture in a company, and then they have to work towards a larger corporate type culture. So these can be problematic and challenges when you're looking at culture work. But this was a kind of another refinement. In the model that I'm currently using for the research to get to that point is an integrated cultural maturity spectrum. And so for me, it's more of a spectrum or a continuum. So it's not as hierarchical. I think that you're going to find any pieces of this in any organization, but which do you have most of? I would argue that that most companies I've worked with tend to be pretty squarely in the middle. The calculative, involving type company, they're either on the low end of that, closer to more reactive or managing, or they're on kind of the higher end of that, which is proactive or cooperating. So that middle level 3 is a wide range, I find, with companies. I find many that are reactive. I find very few that I would argue are overall pathological. And I find very few that are overall generative or really have sustainability or safety baked into their DNA. And so when you have safety baked into the organization, that's when you start getting into these level 4s and 5s of culture. In other words, safety is just how we do things around here. It's not a separate process or program. It's integrated, intimately integrated into operations. And I'll talk a little bit about the indicators for each of these different levels as we kind of move on. But I think it's important for us to understand that this model, this idea, I guess, of culture or safety culture is definitely a moving needle. It's a moving target. There's a continuum. And there's a lot of factors that would involve with that on any given time. So really, how do you measure this? And I think that's really the bulk of the conversation here, and that is it something that's really measurable? I think there's a lot of things out there now where there's a lot of theory, a lot of hypothesis, a lot of plagiarism, a lot of people that think that, it's some way out there idea that we really can't measure. It's just kind of there. I think there's some truth to that. I also heard culture be referred to as the invisible hand, or almost the ethics of it, to where doing the right thing when no one's watching, this kind of idea. But we can measure it. Basically, there's things that we can design, and it's really all about the tools and the instruments and the science that you ground in measuring culture. And I will say this as well. The research that's going on right now with measuring safety culture along these levels that I just described has increased 1,000-fold in the last 10 years. When you go and look for, I'm also a professor at a university and teach, different hazard control and management classes at a graduate level. And what I can tell you is the research I see and have access to, searching for safety culture research, it picked up around the late 90s a little bit. That's when it kind of started after the Bradley model. And that's why I showed you that. And then after the Fleming model, or the HSE report in 2000, then it really kicked up. And then in 2005, it even kicked up more. But then starting, I believe, in about 2010, 2013, 2012, somewhere around there, huge spike. And what we've seen from the last 10 years, 2014 to 2024, is a record number of research articles being published about how to measure safety culture. So it's definitely becoming an emerging science. And I think the methods are becoming more reliable to do that. And my model is based on similar researchers that have done that. Most of the culture research I'm seeing, though, is in the petrogas industry, the nuclear industry, the aviation industry, and then also in certain regions of the world, construction in particular has really embraced this idea of measuring culture and construction. I see a lot of research out of Africa, out of the Middle East, much more than the U.S., but and the UK is having quite a bit too. But this idea of measuring culture, there's a lot of solid research out there. And I would say that everything should be based on previous research and build on that. So the model I'm going to show or suggest here is really, I'm just standing on the shoulders of giants. So I'm basically taking other people's work and trying to frame it and put that out into industry as a researcher and work with some of the clients I have to measure their culture. And it's finding that over the last 3 or 4 years, real interesting to measure culture in an organization. And so really the methods we use are two big research methods, I guess. And all research and safety work is quasi-experimental because we really probably don't have a control group like you do in medical trials and things like that. But nonetheless, the quasi-experimental processes are well-founded. When we look at qualitative versus quantitative research, first of all, on the left or on the right-hand side of the screen, as you're looking at it perhaps, is the quantitative. And this is the traditional metrics. In other words, are there numbers involved? Can we measure things empirically with numbers and statistics and things like this? It's a deductive approach. So in other words, we have these results from a survey, then we deduce down what the reasons might be or make meaning of it from that data. So it's really kind of a top-down deductive approach or logic from a science perspective. We have a hypothesis, we kind of test that. It's quasi-experimental again, and the stratified random sample, which I do, which means I take a small sample or a representative sample from each area of the organization with a goal of about 10% of the entire population is what we're looking for. Now with the survey on the quantitative side, using a survey as a tool, we could launch that survey to thousands. It's really endless how many people we could launch the survey to get that data. But we try to do a random sample, and then we might open it up to the whole population. But it is a perception survey, and then it's really iterative interpretation. In other words, here's a rating on an item on a survey scale, and then we try to make meaning of what that item is in reference to the culture it represents, the cultural element or factor that we're trying to measure. And then on the qualitative side, that gets into your focus groups and interviews and these kind of discussion type survey or type of data collection. And so the approach is inductive. In other words, think of an interview where you're asking open-ended questions to the person interviewing in a dialogue or in a conversation to try to understand their perception about culture. It gives you much more real and depth and formulative hypothesis. In other words, as we listen to that qualitative data and collect it and code that data, we let the data go where it goes. And so it's very inductive. We kind of follow the data a little bit more. And it's more specific because it's first person testimony and they're able to describe it in their own terms. And so trying to capture the essence of safety culture on a survey, I would argue is kind of difficult to do. You really have to get in to talk with people. If you want to deal with culture and understand an organization's culture, you have to talk to people. You have to understand their perspectives. And so I think for culture research, qualitative is a critical component, if not maybe, in my opinion, the most important component of understanding culture in an organization. Because I found looking at the just only quantitative research and surveys, when I talk to people in following those up, I find there's discrepancies, and quite a few. In other words, they tell me that they circle the number they think the company wants them to hear. And so surveys could well be biased or jaded based on what is being communicated on the survey. So if an organization is told they have low survey scores for culture, they ensure the next years are higher, which is good. But did they really change anything, or did they just change the expected narrative of replying on the results of the survey? So qualitative, getting in and talking with people, focus groups and things like that, it really does give a more natural setting. It allows people to describe their experiences, and so it's more experiential driven when it comes to culture. And I think the thing that's been most helpful to understand a culture and then what to do with the results, the recommendations to a client, to the organization as a researcher, I'm able to provide, I think, more actionable intelligence about what the current state of the culture is and what the ideas are, both good and bad, and perhaps ugly in some ways. But it gives very definitive examples. So when I ask how does management demonstrate commitment to safety? On the survey item, we might find that as a very high score that management demonstrates commitment to safety. But when we talk to and do interviews, we might find that that's a very shallow interpretation. In other words, the interview data suggests that the only way a management demonstrates safety is through discipline, enforcing rules, making sure people wear safety glasses, and that's it. And that's interpreted as demonstrating commitment. And it is, but on a survey, if you just look at survey data for that, it might give a skewed or misrepresentative position of what people perceive commitment is. Versus maybe another interview or group that the interview data is a lot deeper, where we get examples of, give me an example of how management is committed to safety. And they're able to provide very solid and several examples without any real prompting by the interviewer. And we got to be careful not to lead the witness. We want them to explain in their words. But we're able to see things like, whenever I identify a hazard, I know I correct it. I talk to my supervisor. My supervisor comes and looks at it. He said, yeah, let me bring this up. Don't use it until we get a solution for it. And then a few days later, they come back, they fix it, and they release it back to operations. So that's an example of a case study or an experience that somebody shares that, in my opinion, indicates a pretty high level of cultural maturity. At least for that particular department or that supervisor, that particular work group, and how they've been able to deal with safety within their operations. And then also with supervisors, their ability or their knowledge about safety work, or managers and their actual knowledge about safety management systems. There's some interviews where it shows that they're very, very weak. They're a manager that's a production manager. They really can't speak to the safety elements of it. They tend to refer to the safety manager or safety director. In other words, that's their problem. That's what safety does. We do operations, they do safety. And they really can't explain in a very sophisticated way what that information is, or what they do, how they lead as a manager or a leader, or how do they integrate safety into how they lead. Versus other organizations where the leadership's pretty robust and it's a really high cultural maturity level, we'll find managers that are talking safety language. And I am a safety professional. I'm not just a researcher. So I actually practice safety as a trade craft. And so when I have managers that are explaining ideas of acceptable levels of risk, a LARP, as low as reasonably practicable, going above and beyond standards, looking for the right thing to do, we're more risk based than we are compliance based, and we try to do right by our people. There's tons of things that are indicators to a higher level of thinking about how safety is integrated into the work, and how the work is designed, how the work is scheduled or scoped out. And construction companies are starting to do a little bit better with that in their bidding process. But anyway, my goal with this, I've been on this slide a little too long, but research methods. Have one, do science. It is better, I think, to have an outside scientist that really knows how to do science help with this, but you can definitely do internal type cultural survey, but you have to recognize the limitations of bias. If you're a manager interviewing your worker, it's going to be biased. So qualitative is really important, but mixed methods, I think that's the message, is really, I think, culture research and culture. To really evaluate culture, you really have to use mixed methods to get really information that's usable. And so really here's the questions, or what might be research questions that the clients may have us explore. And so this idea of, what is the current cultural status? Where are we? What can we do differently? How is supervision engaged at all levels, or how are people engaged at all levels? And, is management having conversations with people about safety? Is it part of their dialogue? And then, what's the level of care? And I find this idea of management level of care to safety is a real key indicator. It really speaks to the idea of accountability and trust, and this idea of demonstration of care, and how a company demonstrates they care for their workers is a real pivotal piece of culture. That trust idea is real critical. So how I've set the model up for the way we're measuring culture is, you take the cultural spectral themes, which we've already seen and from previous models. And so a pathological, reactive, calculative, proactive, and generative. And so we code these and we define them, by the way. So in our master codex of culture, I have specific definitions and indicators and descriptors that go under these cultural buckets from the research and then from my experience and from other things. And so we have 5 levels that we're trying to measure. And we're measuring those with survey data and with interview data. But this is really where we get an overall, where are you at in culture in terms of how the culture is perceived and what the culture does, what the organization does. And within each of these, and so we've got our 5 cultural levels, and then with each of those cultural levels, we're trying to measure these 6 organizational factors. And so the factors are commitment, involvement, process, communication, competency, and leadership. And so the parentheses are just our coding, okay, when we look at coding information or data. And so the codes are the 5 codes from maturity level, and then the 6 codes from organizational factors. And so again, we're trying to, and we have definitions and codexes and examples and descriptors for each of these as well. So now we can really measure what level of culture are we at by what factor. And so we have a relatively sophisticated model of how we might measure it. So now it's a matter of how do we design the instruments or the survey tools and the interview tools. And so this overall mapping those together, this cultural maturity spectrum, as I call it, it's not really a hierarchical model. It's really more of, if you think of a gauge with a needle on a gauge, it's really more of this continuum. Think of a gas tank in your vehicle. Is it half full, quarter full? This idea of where are we at with cultural things, and companies can move between these at any given time, depending on the circumstances. You might find a culture that operates in a proactive generative mode most of the time, normal operations, but all of a sudden emergency operations or certain critical times of their product schedules, they kind of more operate more reactive or even pathological to get the job done. And I think that those things are real. So if we take the ideas of cultural levels, maturity levels, the 5, pathological, reactive, calculative, proactive, and generative on the top, and then we look at the lens. And so we're really looking at culture through the lens of these 6 factors: commitment, involvement, process, communication, competency, and leadership. I think through these lenses of factors to try to understand the culture better and what level of culture are they in based on these kinds of statements. And so, if you look at these generalized, very broad statement under each culture level, under pathological, we don't have anything in place for safety. It's really not important to us. It's really not part of how we do things. Reactive, we only do safety if we have an accident. And I see this in interviews, for example, to where how come they ask me the question perhaps to where, why does somebody have to get hurt before we do anything around here? Or we brought this up and there was no change or anything. And then when somebody got hurt, all of a sudden everybody changes. But it's not long lived. The sustainability tends not to be part of reactive. They get in the accident cycle to where you're going up, all of a sudden we have an incident or an accident or property damage, something like that. And then all of a sudden everybody in the organization is safety, 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 safety. And then all of a sudden over time, it goes back to business as usual. That's called the accident cycle. And you'll find that pretty frequently in reactive type cultures. Calculative, this means they have systems. This is where you start seeing companies that might be ISO 45001 or 14001 certified. So they have certain kinds of management systems that are being audited from third parties. They might have ways of really looking at how do they tie return on investment to safety into their business. They're looking at ways to, maximize or turn safety perhaps into a profit center versus a loss center. They're looking at incident rates and lagging indicators and looking for improvements for that. And usually in calculative on the kind of the right side of that towards proactive, they're starting to look at leading indicators. And I think that's really the line between a calculative and proactive culture is how much reliance they have on leading versus lagging indicators from a dashboard or an organizational decision perspective. And I think that paradigm shift happens between calculative and proactive. But proactive is we actively seek safety and health issues and try to resolve them beforehand. So now you're starting to get into safety by design. Now you're starting to see maybe specialized task groups forming to solve a very specific safety problem and provided the resources to solve it. And when you get into that position, now you're starting to knock on the door of generative or high reliability of a safety type culture where we put health and safety at the heart of everything we do. In other words, it is very much integrated. And I will tell you that cultures that have gotten to that point, or even work crews, it might not even be the whole organization, just within a small team of workers, I've seen generative. I've maybe seen more generative happen at a small level than I have at a organizational level, just by the nature of context. But that generative thinking and that learning organization, as I mentioned earlier, that really starts to live when you get to calculative. Calculative is the bubble culture area. And once you start getting into more of a learning organization approach to safety and health, now you're going to start progressing into a culture that's very much proactive and generative and innovative. I think that's the other key thing about a higher cultural maturity level is a lot of innovation to solve safety problems and not constrained by history or regulations or other things like that. And it allows them to create safety. So when you're looking at the entire culture that's creating safety in a positive way that impacts the job, both in productivity, quality, and safety and health, now you're starting to really look at a high mature culture when it comes to safety. So that's an important piece, is understanding, I think, this full model, the factors involved, what we're trying to measure. And then, with only about 10 minutes left in the talk, let me, and again, if you have questions, and I meant to mention that earlier, please put it in the chat as you have, and some of you have, and so continue to do that. And we'll try to respond to those as best as we can. And then, so how do we do this? Well, we go into organizations. We might launch a survey to everybody or just a small group, but we schedule for about 30 to 45 minute type interviews. And in that time, we actually give them the survey. We give them a few minutes to complete the survey. Then we have a semi-structured interview that is wrapped around culture type ideas or questions. And those semi-structured interview questions might change between interviewees and then also between years that we might measure culture. Validation of statements. This is critically important. What we do with validation of statements is we document the interview, but then we, in writing on a pen and paper, give that to the person for them to validate. And we have a big Sharpie black marker that we can redact anything. And so we make them basically validate the interview statements and say, is this what you mean? Is this what you said? Is this your intent? Did we capture this properly? And the idea is we're there to capture their words based on our questions and their responses. And we want to make sure that we're true and faithful to the interview person, that it's their data, it's their experience. I think as a phenomenologist or a qualitative researcher, the most important thing is I'm very accurately capturing my interview person. I'm not biasing my things into there. I'm not bringing anything into it. I'm really trying to understand their perspective. And this is where skill sets of coaching, for example, and open-ended questions and these ideas of creating an environment where the interviewee is very comfortable in their work, in what they're saying. And these are all anonymous, by the way. There's no way I could even go back to any data set, whether it's survey or interview, and find out who that person was, because I don't put any names to any of it, because that's not important. And the other thing is by them validating that, I found to where we've maybe recommended that we redact things that they said because it might cause them trouble. It may be a little bit too singling them out by what they said. And so we may ask to paraphrase it. Would this be okay if we said it this way, and paraphrase it? And if they agree to it, then that's okay. And a lot of times that's to protect the innocent. It's to not disclose things it protects the confidentiality of the person. And that's really what I'm looking for on validation of statements. One, that they believe that what we documented was accurate to them. It's true to what they said and believe. And then also to make sure that, we have an opportunity to redact it. And we've had some people in the interview say, yeah, I don't really, that might kind of point to me. Well, let's take it out right now. And we'll just totally black ink it out right now. And hopefully they leave with confidence. We do an exit survey, by the way, real quick, this post 5-item evaluation, which so far have been just off the charts positive. And two of the questions in there are, were you feeling intimidated? Do you feel like this? And do you think the process is going to help the organization, or were you nervous about how your information is going to be used? That's the one that really gets some lower scores, but for the most part, it's overall positive, that they're not really concerned about how their information is going to be used. And I think that has to do with the anonymous nature of how we try to protect the confidentiality of the individuals as best as we can. And so from that, we can get demographics that we might slice and dice. And so these are all the typical type of things. This would be, for example, 23 people that we interviewed at one particular site or in one department or area, or it was 10% of that area. So that means there was 230 people in that area, roughly. And so this was the demographics, and we can slice the data by, years of company, years of experience as far as age. Gender might be one. The role, are they operations, a manager? Are they supervisors? Are they labor? There's different ways we can do that. But we work with our clients on how to really define the demographics and know why they want them, or why they want to use them, or why would it be helpful. If we're not going to measure the difference perception between men and women, then we really don't need to have that as part of the demographics. Maybe we want other things instead. Maybe age isn't as important as years of experience, for example. And years with the company may not be as important as years of experience. What the survey may look like is we have kind of the smile sheets where they just take their level of agreement. 1 is strongly disagree and 6 is strongly agree. The reason I go with a 6-point scale is there's no middle ground. To some level, they have to agree or disagree with the statement to some degree. Otherwise, what you find on surveys, and notice this on your 5-point Likert surveys, there's a lot of 3 neutrals. There's a lot of no opinion kind of thing, and that's not very helpful. But these ideas of gradations of degree of agreement give us a little more granular look at the data. So the safety training helps me identify hazards. That's a good example. For this particular data set, it was coded under competency. The average was a 4.6 on a scale of 1 to 6, and then the standard deviation was 1. So it was a little bit of a disperse. When you look at the graph, you can see those numbers are there's quite a variability in the perception on that. What's also interesting is we're able to show the difference between workers or operations and managers and what their perception was one way or the other, and kind of align those. And we can run statistics on all that kind of data, and gives us, well, is this statistically significant or not based on the numbers. The perception survey, again, we can look at, this is the results from one company where we did from 1 year to the next. And by the way, culture surveys really should be done over time. It's really a grounded theory type of model. We have a couple clients where we're on a 10-year contract to really measure culture over a 10-year period. Some are just 2 years or 3 years, some are just 1. But I think to really understand culture and really see if you're improving on a consistent measurement technique, you really have to measure culture over time. I think that once a year might be too far apart. Maybe every 6 months might be a better cultural assessment. But here's a good example of one of the reports where we showed one company or one area, the positive culture versus negative culture was kind of split there. And we found their scores increased by, quite a bit, pretty significant increase in the overall score. And I believe this was the survey data scoring from 1 year to the next, and the numbers tracked really well. So this gives you an idea of the reason for it. And that was my timer saying I'm supposed to be out of time, but I still got more to say. So just very quickly, to look at this, and I believe you guys will be able to get a copy or a PDF copy of this presentation as well. But this is how we code the data. So these are real interview statements that show different levels and different factors that we're coding And to say that this top management modifies results of investigations without involving. In other words, top management's falsifying data. That's a leadership factor, and that's a pathological level 1. So when you look at the L1, that's leadership pathological statement. If you look at a few more down the road, and let's just go to the end, our team reviews job hazard analysis with operations, the workers, to make sure everything is real. It's really reflects the job. And if things don't match up, we work together to make it right. That's a process generative 5 culture statement. So if you think of all the interview statements, which we'll get maybe 300 or 400 interview statements that we code according to this codex, it then starts painting a picture of what are people saying, and is it to what measure, to what factor, or to what culture level. And so at the end, we're able to provide interview data that we're ranking and rating, and we're looking from one year to the next. And again, this is the same company we saw with the survey data, where their survey data improved and their interview data improved in terms of the cultural maturity level by the way they were describing the culture. So this might be a way an organization can measure or look at improvements or changes over time when we look at different elements of how we're measuring safety culture. So in this particular data set, there was a 23% improvement across the 6 culture levels or factors in their overall culture. So they went from kind of a borderline reactive calculative to now a borderline calculative proactive, which means there was a lot of proactive and high reliable statements with very few pathological and reactive statements, and perhaps a lot of calculative statements that were coded to give that particular data. And this might be a look at how we theme our reports to where we have a heat map to kind of show where that, and this is just under the leadership statements. And so under the leadership category, and this may not be the same data that we were looking at earlier, so I've kind of mixed a lot of different kinds of data here just for representation and illustration purposes. So no company data that could be tied to a company is here. But this idea of this heat map to kind of give an idea visually, and then also what are the themes? And so we look at leadership under pathological, and we did this under each of the 5 levels. And so just under pathological, this represents leadership pathological and shows how many statements were codified as that, interpreted as that, and then also this leadership, how do we lack of management support? What are the themes? What are the things that really came out of that? What are the reasons for those scores? And we did this for each level, but for here, I'm just showing the level 1. For an organization, this might be the full spectrum to where we look at where are they at for this particular data set. That big star in the middle, it shows that they have a level of about 2.2. So they're this particular data set, they're right on the verge of right in the early parts of reactive, a lot of pathological. Well, actually, according to this data, there wasn't much. It was all pretty squarely right in the middle of a reactive zone. And that's how that data, shook out. Here's another example of representation of the data. But I'm not going to belabor that, but it does give some other ideas of percentages of data per category. So at the end of the day, on this reflection, what could be explored further? Are we really ensuring that we understand our survey data, how we're validating the data with interview or focus groups, some qualitative type method? And then, do you benchmark off your only past, or are you looking data that's more leading indicator to benchmark from to make decisions in the organization? So I do have a research partner, Regina McMichael, that we've done a lot of this research with. Again, my name is Dan Snyder, and I'm with Safety Mentor, and Regina's with Learning Factory. If you click on the QR code, that'll take you to us, and you can ask us more information. You can also, my email is here. Please send me an email. You can also find me on LinkedIn. So hopefully you enjoyed the presentation. And again, if you have any questions in the chat, please put them in there. And I really appreciate your time joining me today. There's a lot of other great sessions. I know there's been some sessions before me. Hopefully you enjoyed the show. There's going to be many more of good speakers after this as well. So please enjoy the conference and continue your lifelong learning.